Chapter 2, The Basic Tool, a Good Translation. The 66 books of the Protestant Bible were originally written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, most of the Old Testament; Aramaic, a sister language to Hebrew used in half of Daniel and 2 passages in Ezra; and Greek, all of the New Testament. We assume that most of the readers of this book do not know these languages. That means, therefore, that for you the basic tool for reading and studying the Bible is a good English translation, or, as will be argued in this chapter, several good English translations. As we noted in the last chapter, the very fact that you are reading God's Word in translation means that you are already involved in interpretation, and this is so whether one likes it or not. But to read in translation is not a bad thing, it is simply inevitable. What this does mean, however, is that in a certain sense, the person who reads the Bible only in English is at the mercy of the translators, and translators have often had to make choices as to what in fact the original Hebrew or Greek was really intending to say. The trouble with using only one translation, be it ever so good, is that one is thereby committed to the exegetical choices of that translation as the Word of God. The translation you are using may be correct, of course, but it also may be wrong. Let's take, for example, the following 4 translations of 1 Corinthians 7, 36–31 KJV: If a man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin. NASB: If a man think that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter. NIV: If anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to. NEB: If a man has a partner in celibacy and feels that he is not behaving properly towards her. The KJV is very literal, but not very helpful, since it leaves the term virgin and the relationship between the man and his virgin ambiguous. Of one thing, however, one may be absolutely certain: Paul did not intend to be ambiguous. He intended one of the other 3 options, and the Corinthians, who had raised the problem in their letter, knew which one. Indeed, they knew nothing of the other 2. It should be noted here that none of these other 3 is a bad translation, since any of them is a legitimate option as to Paul's intent. However, only one of them can be the correct translation. The problem is, which one? For a number of reasons, the NIV reflects the best exegetical option here. However, if you regularly read only the NASB, which has the least likely option here, then you are committed to an interpretation of the text that may not be the right one. And this kind of thing can be illustrated 1,000 times over. So, what to do? First, it is probably a good practice to use mainly one translation, provided it really is a good one. This will aid in memorization, as well as give you consistency. Also, if you are using one of the better translations, it will have notes in the margin at many of the places where there are difficulties. However, for the study of the Bible, you should use several well-chosen translations. The best thing to do is to use translations that one knows in advance will tend to differ. This will highlight where many of the difficult exegetical problems lie. To resolve these problems you will usually want to have recourse to your commentary. But which translation should you use, and which of the several should you study from? No one can necessarily speak for someone else on this matter. But your choice should not be simply because I like it, or this one is so readable. We want you to like your translation, and if it is a really good one, it will be readable. However, to make an intelligent choice, you need to know some things both about the science of translation itself as well as about some of the various English translations. The science of translation. There are two kinds of choices that a translator must make, textual and linguistic. The first kind has to do with the actual wording of the original text. The second has to do with one's theory of translation. The question of text. The translator's first concern is to be sure that the Hebrew or Greek text he or she is using is as close as possible to the original wording as it left the author's hands, or the hands of the scribe taking it down by dictation. Is this what the psalmist actually wrote? Are these the very words of Mark or Paul? Indeed, why should anyone think otherwise? Although the details of the problem of text in the Old and New Testaments differ, the basic concerns are the same. 1. No original copies manuscripts exist. 2. What do exist are thousands of copies, including copies of very early translations, produced by hand, and copied by hand repeatedly over a period of about 1400 years. 3. Although the vast majority of manuscripts, which for both testaments come from the later medieval period, are very much alike, these later manuscripts differ significantly from the earlier copies and translations. In fact, there are over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of part or all of the New Testament, as well as thousands in Latin, and no two of them anywhere in existence are exactly alike. The problem, therefore, is to sift through all the available material, compare the places where the manuscripts differ, these are called variants, and determine which of the variants represent errors and which one most likely represents the original text. Although this may seem like an imposing task, and in some ways it is, the translator does not despair, because he or she also knows something about textual criticism, the science that attempts to discover the original texts of ancient documents. It is not our purpose here to give the reader a primer in textual criticism. This you may find in convenient form in the articles by Bruce Waltker, Old Testament, and Gordon Fee, New Testament, in Biblical Criticism, Historical, Literary and Textual, Grand Rapids, Zondervan, 1978. Our purpose here is to give some basic information about textual criticism so that you will know why translators must do it and so that you can make better sense of the marginal notes in your translation that say, other ancient authorities add, or, some manuscripts do not have. For the purposes of this chapter, there are 3 things you should be aware of. 1. Textual criticism is a science that works with careful controls. There are 2 kinds of evidence that the translator considers in making textual choices: external evidence, the character and quality of the manuscripts, and the internal evidence, the kinds of mistakes made by copyists. Scholars sometimes differ as to how much weight they give either of these strands of evidence, but all are agreed that the combination of strong external and strong internal evidence together makes the vast majority of choices somewhat routine. But for the remainder, where these 2 lines of evidence seem to collide, the choices are more difficult. The external evidence has to do with the quality and age of the manuscripts that support a given variant. For the Old Testament, this usually amounts to a choice between the Hebrew manuscripts, nearly all of which are medieval copies, and manuscripts of the Greek translations, the Septuagint LXX, which are much earlier. Scholarship has demonstrated that the Hebrew manuscripts by and large reflect a very ancient text. Nonetheless, it often needs correcting from the Septuagint. Sometimes neither the Hebrew nor Greek yields a tolerable sense, at which times conjectures are necessary. For the New Testament, the better external evidence was preserved in Egypt. When that early evidence is also supported by equally early evidence from other sectors of the Roman Empire, such evidence is usually seen to be conclusive. The internal evidence has to do with the copyists and authors. When translators are faced with a choice between two or more variants, they usually can detect which readings are the mistakes because scribal habits and tendencies have been carefully analyzed by scholars and are now well known. Usually the variant that best explains how all the others came about is the one we presume to be the original text. It is also important for the translator to know a given biblical author's style and vocabulary, because these, too, play a role in making textual choices. As already noted, for the vast majority of variants found among the manuscripts, the best, or good, external evidence combines with the best internal evidence to give us an extraordinarily high degree of certainty about the original text. This may be illustrated thousands of times over simply by comparing the KJV, which was based on poor, late manuscripts, with a contemporary translation like the NRSV or NIV. We will note three variants as illustrations of the work of textual criticism. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 16 KJV, your goodliest young men and your asses, NIV, the best of your cattle and donkeys. The text of the NIV, your cattle, comes from the Septuagint, the usually reliable Greek translation of the Old Testament made in Egypt around 250 to 150 BC. The KJV follows the medieval Hebrew text, reading, young men, a rather unlikely term to be used in parallel to donkeys. The origin of the miscopy in the Hebrew text, which the KJV followed, is easy to understand. The word for your young men in Hebrew was written bhrykm, while your cattle was bqrykm. The incorrect copying of a single letter by a scribe resulted in a change of meaning. The Septuagint was translated some time before the miscopy was made, so it preserved the original, your cattle. The accidental change to your young men was made later, affecting medieval Hebrew manuscripts, but too late to affect the pre-medieval Septuagint. Mark chapter 1 verse 2 KJV, as it is written in the prophets, NIV, it is written in Isaiah the prophet. The text of the NIV is found in all the best early Greek manuscripts. It is also the only text found in all early translations, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac, and is the only text known among all the Church Fathers, except one, before the 9th century. It is easy to see what happened in the later Greek manuscripts. Since the citation that follows is a combination of Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 and Isaiah chapter 40 verse 3, a later copyist corrected Mark's original text to make it more precise. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 29 KJV, he that eateth and drinketh unworthily, NIV, anyone who eats and drinks, the word unworthily is not found in any of the earliest and best Greek manuscripts. Its presence in the Latin translations and later Greek manuscripts can easily be explained as an addition brought in from verse 27, where all known manuscripts have unworthily. There is no good way to explain how it might have been dropped out of verse 29 in all the early manuscripts had it been there originally. It should be noted here that for the most part translators work from Greek and Hebrew texts edited by careful, rigorous scholarship. For the New Testament, this means that the best text has already been determined by scholars who are experts in this field. But it also means, for both testaments, that the translators themselves have access to an apparatus, textual information in footnotes, that includes the significant variants with their manuscript support. 2. Although textual criticism is a science, it is not an exact science, because it deals with too many human variables. Occasionally, especially when the translation is the work of a committee, the translators will themselves be divided as to which variant represents the original text and which is, the scribal errors. Usually at such times the majority choice will be found in the actual translation, while the minority choice will be in the margin. The reason for the uncertainty is either that the best manuscript evidence conflicts with the best explanation of the corruption, or that the manuscript evidence is evenly divided and either variant can explain how the other came to be. We can illustrate this from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 3, NIV text, surrender my body to the flames, NIV margin, surrender my body that I may boast. In Greek the difference is only one letter, kauthamsamai, kauchemsamai. Both variants have good early support, and both have some inherent difficulties in interpretation. 1 Corinthians was written well before Christians were martyred by burning, yet it is difficult to find an appropriate meaning for that I may boast. Here is one of those places where a good commentary will probably be necessary in order for you to make up your own mind. The preceding example is a good place for us also to refer you back to the last chapter. You will note that the choice of the correct text is one of the content questions. A good exegete must know, if it is possible to know, which of these words is what Paul actually wrote. On the other hand, it should be also noted that Paul's point here finally is little affected by that choice. In either case, he means that if one gives the body over to some extreme sacrifice, or the like, but lacks love, it is all for nothing. This, then, is what it means to say that translators must make textual choices, and it also explains one of the reasons why translations will sometimes differ, and also why translators are themselves interpreters. Before we go on to the second reason why translations differ, we need to make a note here about the King James Version. 3. The KJV is not only the most widely used translation in the world, it is also a classic expression of the English language. Indeed, it coined phrases that will be forever embedded in our language. However, for the New Testament, the only Greek text available to the 1611 translators was based on late manuscripts, which had accumulated the mistakes of over 1,000 years of copying. Few of these mistakes, and we must note that there are many of them, make any difference to us doctrinally, but they often do make a difference in the meaning of certain specific texts. This is why for study you should use almost any modern translation rather than the KJV. How to choose between modern translations takes us to the next kinds of choices translators have to make. The questions of language, the next two kinds of choices, verbal and grammatical, bring us to the actual science of translation. The problem has to do with the transferring of words and ideas from one language to another. To understand what various theories underlie our modern translations, you will need to become acquainted with the following technical terms: original language, the language that one is translating from, in our case, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. Receptor language, the language that one is translating into, in our case, English. Historical distance. This has to do with the differences that exist between the original language and the receptor language, both in matters of words, grammar, and idioms, as well as in matters of culture and history. Theory of translation. This has to do with the degree to which one is willing to go in order to bridge the gap between the two languages. For example, should lamp be translated flashlight or torch in cultures where these serve the purpose a lamp once did? Or should one translate it lamp and let the reader bridge the gap for himself or herself? Should holy kiss be translated the handshake of Christian love in cultures where public kissing is offensive? Notice how these three terms apply to the following basic theories of translation. Literal, the attempt to translate by keeping as close as possible to the exact words and phrasing in the original language, yet still makes sense in the receptor language. A literal translation will keep the historical distance intact at all points. Free, the attempt to translate the ideas from one language to another, with less concern about using the exact words of the original. A free translation, sometimes also called a paraphrase, tries to eliminate as much of the historical distance as possible. Dynamic equivalent, the attempt to translate words, idioms, and grammatical constructions of the original language into precise equivalents in the receptor language. Such a translation keeps historical distance on all historical and most factual matters, but updates matters of language, grammar, and style. Translators are not always consistent, but one of these theories will govern the translator's basic approach to their task. At times the literal or free translations can be excessive, so much so that Clarence Jordan in his Cotton Patch version can translate Paul's letter to Rome as to Washington, while Robert Young, in a literal translation published in 1862, can transform 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1 into this impossible English, whoredom is actually heard of among you, and such whoredom as is not even named among the nations, as that one hath the wife of the father. The several translations of the whole Bible that are currently easily accessible might be placed on a historical distance scale in a somewhat arbitrary way, as shown on the next page. The best translational theory is dynamic equivalence. A literal translation is often helpful as a second source. It will give you confidence as KJV, RSV, NRSV, NIV, GN, Phillips Pound, NASB, NAB, JB, NEB. Dynamic literal equivalence free to what the Greek or Hebrew actually looked like. A free translation also can be helpful, to stimulate your thinking about the possible meaning of a text. But the basic translation for reading and studying should be something like the NIV. The problem with a literal translation is that it keeps distance at the wrong places, in language and grammar. Thus the translator often renders the Greek or Hebrew into English that is otherwise never written or spoken that way. It is like translating Maison Blanc from French to English as house white. For example, no native English-speaking person would ever have said coals of fire, KJV, Rom. 12:20. That is a literal rendering of the Greek construction, but what it means in English is burning coals, NIV, or live coals, NEB. A second problem with a literal translation is that it often makes the English ambiguous, where the Greek or Hebrew was quite clear to the original recipients. For example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 16 the Greek phrase katasarko can be translated literally to know, according to the flesh, as in the NASB. But this is not an ordinary way of speaking in English. Furthermore, the phrase is ambiguous. Is it the person who is being known who is, according to the flesh, which seems to be implied in the NASB, and which in this case would mean something like by their outward appearance? Or is the person who is knowing, doing so, according to the flesh, which would mean, from a worldly point of view? In this case the Greek is clear, and the NIV correctly translates. So from now on, since we have been raised to a new life, version 15, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. The problem with a free translation, on the other hand, especially for study purposes, is that the translator updates the original author too much. Furthermore, such a translation all too often comes close to being a commentary. A free translation is always done by a single translator, and unless the translator is also a skilled exegete who knows the various problems in all of the biblical passages, there is a danger that the reader will be misled. This is especially true of the popular, but unfortunately not altogether accurate, Living Bible. We can live with such translations as Flashlights Ps. 119-105, or Handshakes 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 14, or Pancakes General 18-6, but to translate the Greek word charismata, spiritual gifts, as special abilities, in 1 Corinthians 12-14 is to take too much liberty. The Living Bible translation of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 10, as a sign that she is under man's authority, is especially misleading since the original implies that she is the one who has the authority. In 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13, the biblical author deliberately used the cryptic designation Babylon for Rome. It is surely better to have that explained somewhere than to translate it Rome, and destroy Peter's purposefully cryptic usage. As readable as the Living Bible is, it simply has too many inaccuracies and rewritings for it to be one's only, or even primary, Bible. The New Revised Standard Version (NRSV) is much more accurate than the Living Bible and is not a free translation, but it has taken certain liberties with the text in order to be gender-neutral when speaking about people. This results in sometimes abnormal English that is politically correct, but not very idiomatic. Thus in John chapter 3 verse 4 the NRSV has the awkward sentence, "Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born?" compared with the more normal original RSV, "Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" Likewise, for Psalm chapter 1, whereas the RSV helpfully preserves the intended contrast between the lone righteous person, "Blessed is the man who v.1, and the many who are wicked, the wicked are not so, v.4, this contrast is eliminated by the NRSV's pluralizing of the entire psalm, "Happy are those who," etc., in an effort to avoid the gender distinctions that can occur with singular pronouns. The way various translations handle the problem of historical distance can best be noted by illustrating several of the kinds of problems involved. 1. Weights, measures, money. This is a particularly difficult area. Does one transliterate the Greek and Hebrew terms, ephah, homer, etc., or try to find their English equivalents? If one chooses to go with equivalents in weights and measures, does one use the standard pounds and feet, or does one look to the future and translate liters and meters? Inflation can make mockery of monetary equivalents in a few years. The problem is further complicated by the fact that measures or money are often used to suggest contrasts or startling results, as in Matthew chapter 18 verses 24 to 28 or Isaiah chapter 5 verse 10. To transliterate in these cases will likely cause an English reader to miss the point of the passage. The KJV, followed closely by the RSV and NRSV, was inconsistent in these matters. For the most part they transliterated, so that we got baths, ephahs, homers, shekels, and talents. Yet the Hebrew amma was translated cubit, the zerath, a span, and the Greek mna, mina, became the British pound, while the denarius became a mere penny. For Americans, all of these have the effect of being meaningless or misleading. The NASB uses cubit and span, but otherwise consistently transliterates and then puts an English equivalent in the margin, except for John chapter 2 verse 6, where the transliteration is in the margin. This is also the way the NIV chose to go, except for cubits, which are turned into feet, and all the marginal notes are given both in English standards and in metric equivalents. Unfortunately, they give no note at all in Matthew chapter 20 verse 2, where the fact that the denarius was a regular day's wage is important to the parable. Moreover, in Mark chapter 14 verse 5 they abandon this principle altogether by translating the 300 denarii into the equivalent, more than a year's wages. The Living Bible, as may be expected, turns everything into equivalents, but often they are not precise, and the turning of denarii into dollar amounts of the 1960s is a precarious procedure at best. We would argue that either equivalents or transliterations with marginal notes would be good procedure with most weights and measurements. However, the use of equivalents is surely to be preferred in the passages like Isaiah chapter 5 verse 10 and Matthew chapter 18 verses 24 to 28. Note how much more meaningful the GNB renders these verses than does the NASB. Isaiah chapter 5 verse 10 NASB, for 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine. And a homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. GNB, the grapevines growing on 5 acres of land will yield only 5 gallons of wine. 10 bushels of seed will produce only 1 bushel of grain. Matthew chapter 18 verses 24, 28 NASB, there was brought to him one who owed him 10,000 talents. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. GNB, one of them was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. Then the man went out and met one of his fellow servants who owed him a few dollars. 2. Euphemisms. Almost all languages have euphemisms for matters of sex and toilet. A translator has one of 3 choices in such matters. 1. Translate literally, but perhaps leave an English-speaking reader bewildered or guessing. 2. Translate the literal equivalent, but perhaps offend or shock the reader. Or 3. Translate with an equivalent euphemism. Option 3 is probably the best, if there is an appropriate euphemism. Otherwise it is better to go with option 2, especially for matters that generally no longer require euphemisms in English. Thus to have Rachel say, "I'm having my period," General 31-35 NIV, cf. GNB, is to be preferred to the literal, "The manner of women is upon me," NASB, cf. KJV RSV. For the same idiom in Genesis chapter 18 verse 11, the GNB is consistent. Sarah had stopped having her monthly periods, while the NIV is much freer. Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Similarly, he forced her, and lay with her. 2 Sam 13:14 KJV becomes simply, he raped her, in the NIV and GNB. There can be dangers in this, however, especially when translators themselves miss the meaning of the idiom, as can be seen in the NIV, GNB, and Pound translation of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1, "It is good for a man not to marry." The idiom, to touch a woman, in every other case in antiquity means to have sexual intercourse with a woman, and never means anything close to marry. Here the nab, which has found an equivalent euphemism, is much to be preferred. A man is better off having no relations with a woman. 3. Vocabulary. When most people think of translation, this is the area they usually have in mind. It seems like such a simple task: find the English word that means the same as the Hebrew or Greek word. But finding precisely the right word is what makes translation so difficult. Part of the difficulty is not only in the choosing of an appropriate English word, but also in choosing a word that will not already be filled with connotations that are foreign to the original language. The problem is further complicated by the fact that some Hebrew or Greek words have ranges of meaning different from anything in English. In addition, some words can have several shades of meaning, as well as 2 or more considerably different meanings. And a deliberate play on words is usually impossible to translate from one language to another. We have already noted how various translations have chosen to interpret virgin in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 36. In chapter 1 we also noted the difficulty in rendering Paul's use of the word sarx, flesh. In most cases, almost anything is better than the literal flesh. The NIV handles this word especially well, sinful nature, when Paul is contrasting flesh and spirit, human nature, in Romans chapter 1 verse 3, where it refers to Jesus's Davidic descent, from a worldly point of view, in 2 Corinthians 5:16 noted above, cf. 1 Cor. 1:26 by human standards, and body, when it means that, as in Col 1:22. This kind of thing can be illustrated many times over and is one of the reasons why a translation by dynamic equivalent is much to be preferred to a literal translation. 4. Grammar and syntax. Even though most Indo-European languages have a great many similarities, each language has its own preferred structures as to how words and ideas are related to each other in sentences. It is at these points especially where translation by dynamic equivalent is to be preferred. A literal translation tends to abuse or override the ordinary structures of the receptor language by directly transferring into it the syntax and grammar of the original language. Such direct transfers are usually possible in the receptor language, but they are seldom preferable. From hundreds of examples, we choose 2 as illustrations, one from Greek and one from Hebrew. One of the characteristics of Greek is its fondness for what are known as genitive constructions. The genitive is the ordinary case of possession, as in my book. Such a true possessive can also, but only very awkwardly, be rendered, the book of me. However, other possessives in English, such as God's grace, do not so much mean, for example, that God owns the grace as that he gives it, or that it comes from him. Such non-true possessives can always be translated into English as the grace of God. The Greek language has a great profusion of these latter kinds of genitives, which are used, for example, as descriptive adjectives to express source, to connote special relationships between two nouns, etc. A literal translation almost invariably transfers these into English with an of phrase, but frequently with strange results, such as the coals of fire noted above, or the word of his power, Heb 1-3 KJV. Both of these are clearly adjectival or descriptive genitives, which in the NIV are more accurately rendered, burning coals, and his powerful word. Similarly, the NASB's steadfastness of hope 1 Thess. 1-3 and joy of the Holy Spirit 1-6 are translated in the NIV endurance inspired by hope and joy given by the Holy Spirit. These are not only to be preferred, they are in fact more accurate because they give a genuine English equivalent rather than a literal, Greek way of expressing things, which in English would be nearly meaningless. Interestingly enough, in one of the few places where the KJV, followed by the RSV, but not the NASB, offered something of an equivalent 1 Cor. 3-9, the translators missed the meaning of the genitive altogether. Apparently they were led astray by the word fellow workers and thus translated, for we are laborers together with God, ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. But in Paul's sentence each occurrence of God is clearly a possessive genitive, with an emphasis on both we, Paul and Apollos, and you, the church, as God's field and building, as belonging to him. This is correctly translated in the NIV as, for we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. Paul's point is made even more clearly in the NAB, we are God's co-workers, while you are his cultivation, his building. Thousands of times in the Old Testament the KJV translators woodenly followed the Hebrew word order in a way that does not produce normal, idiomatic English. Did you ever notice, for example, how many verses or sentences in the KJV begin with the word and? Read Genesis chapter 1, and note that with the single exception of verse 1, every verse of the chapter begins with and, a total of 30 times. Now compare the NIV. It reduces the number of occurrences of and to 11, while at the same time improving the flow of the language so that it sounds more natural to the ear. The NIV translators produced an improved translation by taking seriously the fact that the vast majority of prose sentences in Old Testament Hebrew begin with one of the two Hebrew forms for the word and. The word for and appears even when there is absolutely nothing preceding to which the sentence logically connects. In fact, 6 books of the Old Testament, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, Ezra, Ruth, and Esther, begin in Hebrew with the word and, though they obviously do not follow anything. Accordingly, it is now recognized by Hebrew grammarians that and at the beginning of a sentence is virtually the equivalent of the use of capitalization at the beginning of English sentences. This does not mean that the Hebrew and should never be translated by the English and, it simply means that and is only sometimes, and certainly not a majority of the time, the best translation in English. The simple English sentence beginning with a capital letter will do nicely in most cases. Another example is the KJV's, and it came to pass. This is not used in normal English speech anymore, and it was rare even in the 17th century when the KJV was undertaken. Because this Hebrew narrative verb form was followed literally and woodenly, the resulting translation was, "and it came to pass," which thereafter occupied a prominent position in Old Testament style but nowhere else in English speech. We once heard a sermon on the concept that all things are temporary and shall eventually pass away, cf. 1 Cor. 13-8-10, based on the frequency of the clause, "and it came to pass," which the preacher misunderstood to mean, "and it came in order to pass away." In fact, the NIV translators rightly do not translate the Hebrew clause as such. Judiciously rendering Hebrew into English requires an equivalent meaning, not an equivalent word or clause pattern. On choosing a translation, we have been trying to help you choose a translation. We shall conclude with a few summary remarks about several translations. First, it should be noted that we have not tried to be exhaustive. There are still other translations of the whole Bible that we have not included in our discussion, not to mention over 75 others of the New Testament alone that have appeared in the 20th century. Several of those latter are excellent, and well worth using, e.g., Weymouth, 1903, Helen Montgomery, 1924, Williams, 1937. Among these also are several free translations, two of which are much to be preferred to the Living Bible because of their higher degree of accuracy. Phillips, 1947, F. A. F. Bruce, Epistles of Paul Only, 1965. Among the whole Bible translations not discussed are some that are theologically biased, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation, 1961. This is an extremely literal translation, filled with the heretical doctrines of this cult. Others of these translations are eccentric, such as that by George Lamsa, 1940, who believed that a Syriac translation from around AD 400 held the keys to everything. One should probably also include here the Amplified Bible, which has had a run of popularity far beyond its worth. It is far better to use several translations, note where they differ, and then check out those differences in another source, than to be led to believe that a word can mean one of several things in any given sentence, with the reader left to choose whatever best strikes his or her fancy. Which translation, then, should you read? We would venture to suggest that the NIV is as good a translation as you will get. The GNB and NAB are also especially good. One would do well to have two or all three of these. The NIV is a committee translation by the best scholarship in the evangelical tradition, the NAB is a committee translation by the best scholarship in the American Catholic tradition. The GNB is an outstanding translation by a single scholar. Robert G. Bratcher, who regularly consulted with others, and whose expertise in linguistics has brought the concept of dynamic equivalence to translation in a thoroughgoing way. Along with one or more of these, you would also do well to use one or more of the following: the NASB, the RSV, or the NRSV. These are attempts to update the KJV. The translators used better original texts and thereby eliminated most of the non-original matter in the KJV. At the same time they tried to adhere as closely as possible to the language of the KJV and yet still modernize it some. The RSV and NRSV are by far the better translations. The NASB is much more like the KJV and therefore far more literal, to the point of being wooden. Along with one or more of these, we recommend you also consult either the NEB or JB, or both. Both of these are committee translations. The NEB is the product of the best of British scholarship, and is therefore filled with British idioms not always familiar to American readers. The JB is an English translation from the French Bible de Jerusalem. Both of these translations tend to be freer at times than the others described here as dynamic equivalent. But both of them have some outstanding features and are well worth using in conjunction with the others. In the following chapters we will follow the NIV, unless otherwise noted. If you were regularly to read this translation, and then consult at least one from three other categories RSV, NRSV, NASB, GNB, NAB, NEB, JB, you would be giving yourself the best possible start to an intelligent reading and study of the Bible.